Good afternoon and welcome to this tutorial. Voting is one of the most important processes since a long time in our society, and with the advent of digital voting, internet voting, a lot of interesting issues arise, technical security issues as well as more interdisciplinary issues. And we are lucky enough to have today with us an expert since decades on cryptographic protocols and on e-voting, who will enlighten us with an invited tutorial on design and analysis of end-to-end verifiable voting systems.
Okay, thank you. Well, it's not actually decades, it's about a decade. Okay, well, many thanks to the organizers for the invitation to give this tutorial. So I hope you'll enjoy it. 90 minutes is actually quite short, I think, to cover everything I would ideally like to say, because it is a vast and fascinating topic. And I think the key thing I want to try and convey, if nothing else, is that it's a very exciting area, it's very challenging, it's obviously very societally important. I was chatting to Vitaly over lunch, and he actually made the comment, which I rather liked, that it seems to be the hardest problem in security in some sense, because it is so very interdisciplinary. It's not purely a sort of technical crypto mathematical type problem, but it has all the social aspects, but I'll talk more about that later. But that's the sort of key point I want to try and convey to you. So it's going to be a pretty quick overview of the topic, the sort of state of the art, at least as I see it. It will be heavily biased, let me say that immediately. I will tend to emphasize stuff I've worked on, not necessarily because I think it's the best stuff, but it's the most familiar stuff to me. I should also say, I'm not quite sure, even now, looking around, quite what kind of audience I have, so I've kept it moderately high level, so I'm not plunging into a lot of sort of crypto mathematical details, although I'm happy to do that if people want to go deeper. And that brings me, I guess, onto the other point that, do please, it's meant to be a tutorial, so let's make it as interactive as possible. So if I go over things too quickly or confusingly, do please pull me up, ask questions, make comments, and so on. Okay, so I think that's enough of a preamble. So let me just quickly describe the outline. So first of all, I'll talk a little bit of motivation. I suspect I don't have to say too much about why voting is important, but I'll say a little bit about the challenges that we face here in trying to make voting secure. And then I'll go on to this kind of new concept, if you like, which the crypto security people have brought to the scene, this notion of end-to-end verifiability, which is basically, to jump ahead a little bit, providing voters with an ability to confirm that their vote is accurately counted, but at the same time obviously countering vote buying and coercion threats. And clearly that's not something which is available with conventional systems. So it's kind of new property that cryptography appears to make possible, which was not possible previously. And then I'll talk briefly about, one of the key systems I've been involved in, Prêt. Time permitting, I'll talk perhaps a little bit about what I've called Prêt goes under, because a variant of it was, back in November 2014, was actually used for a sort of real election on a small scale in Victoria State in Australia. That was quite an interesting experience. It was very different. It taught me how very different it is to try and develop and deploy a real system from just writing a paper about an academic system. So I'll go over that quickly. I'll briefly talk about some of the other sort of rival schemes, if you like. And then again, time permitting, I'll try and touch on a new scheme I've been working on for the last year or so, which takes a very different approach, hopefully makes the verification steps for the voters much more understandable and easy to perform. And then we'll end with conclusions and open questions. Does that sound all right to everyone? But feel free to sort of steer it and ask me to go into more detail or whatever. Okay, so motivation, well, I guess it's clear to everyone, voting is, if you like, the foundation of democracy. Without that, there would be no democracy. And of course, it's crucial not only that we can announce a result, we want the result to be correct reflection of the votes cast, but furthermore, we need to demonstrate to everybody. So it's not just that they're correct, but they're demonstrably correct to everyone. Okay, in particular, you have to persuade the losers they actually lost, and make sure they don't have grounds to challenge your election, the outcome. And of course, nowadays, well, historically, democratic societies have evolved what seem to be quite effective ways of making voting trustworthy and trusted. But increasingly there's moves to move to digital technology and so on, which introduces whole new rafts of threats and so forth, and often very poorly understood. And so that's why when it starts to become interesting to a community like ourselves, I guess. And furthermore, there's a lot of companies out there that are offering, seriously scary solutions that they claim are secure, but when you look at them, they just fall apart. But again, I'll say a little bit more about that later. Okay, so as I said at the outset, what is really fascinating is it is a highly socio-technical kind of problem. I mean, that's kind of true of most security critical systems, I guess, but I think it's even more so of voting systems, because basically your users are potentially the entire populace, right? So everybody with a whole varying skills, disabilities and so on and so forth have to be able to use this system and probably to some extent understand the properties that it offers. And they perhaps use the system once every 4 years, so it's not as though it's something they're using every day and get used to using and so forth. So that's one aspect, one of the things that makes it really tricky. I mean, another really nice thing is that, as I hope I'll sort of briefly illustrate, is that just about every trick in the cryptographer's toolbox finds application in voting. So zero knowledge proofs, oblivious transfer, designated verifier proofs, so on and so forth. Just about everything finds application here, homomorphic encryption, etc., etc. And furthermore, as again I'll try and illustrate rather quickly, it introduces a lot of quite novel properties which I don't think really occur in other systems, like coercion resistance. How precise do you define that? Is, as far as I know, a fairly novel kind of property and a very subtle one, very difficult to capture. Again, I'll try and illustrate that. And as I said, it has to be understandable by just about everyone. Okay, so the real issue, difficulty with elections, at least if we're talking about private, secure private voting, voting with ballot privacy, vote privacy, is that we need to be able to demonstrate that the result is correct, but still maintain the privacy of everybody's vote. Okay, so nobody should have a sort of God's eye view of what the correct answer is, so it's not like running a conventional mathematical algorithm we can just sort of rerun independently and confirm the result. Okay, so clearly, as is I'm sure clear to you, if you just want verifiability, it's fairly trivial, just a show of hands does that. If you just want ballot secrecy, that's trivial. You just announce whatever result you want, independent of the votes, and that gives you ballot privacy, right? So independently, they're trivial. But what we're really trying to do, well, certainly if we come at it with the mindset of a cryptographer and security specialist, is we want to guarantee both of these properties, and furthermore, we want to do it as far as possible without trusted parties. Okay, so again, if you had a trusted third party, you just hand all the votes to them, they keep them private and count them reliably and announce the result. That would be trivial, right? But that's not the kind of solution that we want. Partly for intellectual reasons, but also for societal reasons. That just wouldn't be satisfactory. Okay, so if you like, in God we trust, everybody else must provide proofs, as they say, right? Okay, and so another comment on this slide which is worth making is it's a very highly adversarial situation, right? Every player in the game is potentially trying to cheat the system or the other players. Okay, voters might be trying to cheat the system in some way. The system, the officials, for example, might be trying to cheat the voters, if you like, manipulate the result. We maybe have coercers on the side trying to influence voters. We have voters perhaps trying to cheat the coercers, and that's an interesting one because the others we want to try and suppress. That last one is, as you'll see, is one that we want to try and enable. We want voters to be able to cheat the coercers in some sense, or vote buyers. So it's a very rich environment to explore from a security point of view. Okay, so how about issues of trust? Well, I mean, I think one of the things that really motivated a lot of the work over the last decade or two in this area is the deployment of touchscreen machines in the US by Diebold and Sequoia and stuff. And these, of course, are really scary, right? I mean, you press the button for your candidate, it comes back, says thank you for your vote for Kerry or whatever, and after that you just have to trust what the software does to your vote. And so this is seriously scary. And of course, attacks, you can change just a subtle line of code, and you can completely throw the election in a way that is virtually undetectable if you do it cleverly, and that's the worst possible situation. I mean, it occurred to me as I was mulling over this last night. In a sense, voters in this situation get the worst of all worlds. They potentially lose the integrity of their vote, and furthermore, they potentially lose the privacy of their vote. So their intended vote might not be counted as intended, but a coercer gets to see their intended vote. So they sort of lose potentially in both respects. And in the US, the situation was particularly bad because a lot of the code that was in these Diebold, Sequoia, etc. machines was proprietary and was not, available for public inspection. Again, I might say a little bit more about that in a minute. So, the picture's gone a bit fuzzy. Yeah, please, yeah. Well, there certainly have been problems. So there were things like machines announcing results which were greater than the number of people who'd been registered to vote. I think there was even an instance of a machine delivering a supposedly negative count for a candidate. So there have been certainly manifest. But at least these are manifest things. You know that's gone wrong. And part of the problem here, of course, which is worth emphasizing, it's a good point, is that things can go wrong in a way which is undetectable. I mean, that's really the crucial problem here. So the usual mantra that, absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence, really plays here. Whether there's actually documented instances of proof of deliberate manipulation, I think that's less clear. There are certainly a lot of suspicious instances, but yeah.
I know of one instance of deliberate manipulation in Dutch elections. I think the Dutch voting machines used until perhaps 10 years ago. Oh yes, thank you.
The NEDAP machines, you mean?
Yes, the NEDAP machines also contain some proprietary code, and they have been used in Dutch elections until about 10 years ago. I think about 15 or 13 years ago, there was a communal vote in the southwest of the Netherlands, where actually one of the candidates for that vote was also a member of a board that supervised the voting in one of the places where you could vote. Now that place was installed in a way that the members of the board couldn't see each other well. And the candidate then, based on a software error of the NEDAP voting machine, could manipulate the result so that he himself got about 100 votes. And it was a very suspect thing, because in all the other offices where voters could vote, he got almost no votes at all. So afterwards, some statisticians asked people who had elected at that office if they were willing to disclose what they had voted for, and based on that, they could give an estimate of how improbable the voting outcome is. And I think based on that, he got convicted for manipulation.
Good. Cool. So, it led to conviction. What more can you ask? I think there's another question at the back. Sandro.
4 days ago, somebody claimed that they won the election in 2012 for president. Have you heard about that? This is the Mexican presidential election. That's in the Guardian of the
Okay, I don't know the details of that, but and there's evidence.
There's 4 days ago, there's an article in the Guardian newspaper where a hacker claims he swung the presidential election in Mexico in 2012. He also claims he influenced elections in other Latin American countries using that.
Okay.
It's not based on manipulation of the voting machine. I mean, the more manipulation of the media, stealing information from opponents, etc.
Oh, well, that's okay. Okay. All right. Well, that's just to illustrate situations where clearly there's been major mistrust in the outcome of elections, which many of you will have seen. Okay, and yes, so for example, in the US, at least in some previous elections, around 30% of the electorate are actually using these DRE machines, which is sort of seriously scary. And just to jump to the bottom, yes, I mean, with the ETAPS machines, I think the problem there was more about confidentiality was what really killed them, right? When they discovered that you could have leakage of how you were voting with tempest emanations and stuff. But I think there was a lot of other suspicious aspects. But what I think really killed it was the secrecy leakage, side channel leakage. Okay, so let me just very quickly spin through just to illustrate. So when I started to get into this subject about a decade ago, what really surprised me is that the US, I discovered, has actually been experimenting with technologies for voting for well over a century. So, for example, these kind of lever machines actually came in at the end of the 19th century, which is, I suspect this is a more modern, that doesn't look particularly 19th century, but I guess that gives you the idea. So these things weigh a couple of tons or something and have lots of levers and things. And they were actually being used, I think, in New Jersey until fairly recently, or possibly even in some places in counties still being used. And then you have things like OpScan. That's actually probably one of the better technologies. The touchscreen, of course, as I've mentioned, which are the really scary things. You've probably all heard about these punch scan things, right? And that rather scary looking, he's actually an eminent judge, I think, right? Whose name I forget, but... So you probably all saw this kind of stuff where people were worried about these hanging chads and pregnant chads and so on and so forth. So in short, and by the way, there's a very nice book. If you're interested in this kind of stuff, Steal This Vote by Andrew Gumbel has a beautiful account of all this kind of stuff, or basically the history of sort of democracy and voting in the US from the outset. And it's full of sort of beautiful stories about how these systems were hacked. As well as the more traditional paper ballots. Okay. So with that sort of preamble, hopefully that gives you the sort of background to the problem. So let me now introduce in a bit more detail this concept of end-to-end verifiability. So what we're attempting to do is provide voters with some means to confirm to their own satisfaction that their vote is accurately counted in the vote, but of course at the same time avoiding any way of introducing any vote buying or coercion threats. And if you stop to think about it, you realize that this is a sort of very delicate path to tread. And so what typically happens in most of the systems, and I'll skim over a few of them as I said, is when you cast your vote, when the voter casts their vote, they get some kind of encrypted or encoded version of their vote in some kind of receipt, or perhaps typically a paper receipt, or I guess possibly a digital, perhaps digitally signed electronic form, but typically a paper receipt. And the point of this is that once the elections ended, all of these encrypted receipts should be posted to a so-called web bulletin board, secure web bulletin board. Again, I'll say a little bit more about what that is a little later. But the basic idea is this should be publicly visible to everyone. Everyone should have a consistent view of it. Anything that's posted there, it should be append only. Anything posted should stay there. And so the idea is that voters, or perhaps proxies acting on their behalf, can go to this bulletin board, confirm that their receipt appears accurately on that bulletin board, and assuming that that's everybody's happy with that, then we should be in a situation where basically we've got the collection of encrypted votes on this web bulletin board, and at that point then it becomes a fairly conventional crypto-mathematical problem to anonymize them and count them. Again, I'll say a little bit more about that process, but in the interest of time, not very much. Okay, so this provides a sort of classic indirection. I think I have a picture of this in a minute. The idea is, so it's encrypted clearly so that even if they show this to a third party, that doesn't convey how they voted, but it does give them the means to confirm that their vote is included in the subsequent tally process. Okay, so that's the basic idea, the standard idea. Selini actually departs from that, but I'll come to that at the end. Okay, so that gives you a very high-level view of what end-to-end verifiability means and how it's typically done. Yes, please. There's a junk votes. Well, okay, that's another issue, yes. For time, I'm kind of glossing over things a little bit. So basically, the mechanism I just described is a way of guaranteeing that voters' votes are included. It doesn't of itself guarantee that ballot stuffing hasn't occurred. So you do need other mechanisms for that. So sometimes people ask for what's called universal eligibility verifiability, which basically means that everybody should be able to look at the web bulletin board and confirm that all receipts there, well, every receipt has been cast by a different eligible voter, and only one per voter. So typically that means you need some PKI, signing ability to sign ballots. If you don't have that, then you need more procedural mechanisms. Let's say if you're working from a polling station, you have to authenticate voters, make sure that they only get to cast one ballot. You have to keep a record of the numbers of voters who cast votes and check that the number. So it's tricky in general. Yeah, there's more to be said, but I should crack on. Yeah. Well, of them, sorry, yeah. So the question was, are the receipts anonymous? Well, sometimes you see the suggestion that they should actually be posted alongside the voter's name. Actually, in fact, that's precisely as one mechanism to try and counter ballot stuffing, so people can spot if there's spurious. In that case, they're not anonymous, obviously. But you don't necessarily have to do that. I mean, they could just be posted as encrypted blobs. Of course, a coercer can potentially track them back to a voter if they go to the voter and say, "Show me your receipt." Then that creates a kind of link. So in principle, they can be anonymous. Yeah.
The end-to-end verifiable voting means that you can see when you voted on based on your receipts. You can check the nature of your vote for party A or B if you use your receipt.
Not directly, you can't. I mean, I'll perhaps try and make that a little bit clearer. So the receipt carries your vote in encrypted form, hidden form, right?
How can you check if the vote is actually accurate? Suppose you
Yeah.
party A, but...
Okay. So my question, if it's not recorded, can the voters see where they voted on based on their receipt? If not, it could be that the internal system has a different...
Yeah, well, that's a good point. But so the answer is, certainly with the conventional schemes, they cannot directly see their vote because it's buried in cryptographically, so it's kind of hidden from everyone, including the voters themselves. In the Selini scheme at the end, actually, that's different, but I'll come to that later. So I'll describe shortly a little bit about... So you're right. The voters need a way to be convinced that the correct vote is in that ciphertext.
Yes,
and I'll talk more about that. I mean, that's where things get really tricky and interesting. That's, in fact, the crucial thing that I want to convey in this tutorial.
But there is a side issue, namely if they are convinced, if there is a way to convince the voter where they voted for, somebody else could coerce the voter, and then in the privacy of their home, check if the voter actually voted for what they were coerced to vote
precisely.
for.
This is why it's so delicate. And this is the point I was kind of trying to make at the beginning, but I probably didn't make it forcefully enough. So thank you for your question for bringing it out. This is precisely why it's so difficult. We need a way of creating these encrypted votes in a way which convinces the individual voter that their correct vote is buried in this encryption, but doesn't provide them any way that they can transfer that conviction or proof to a third party. And so that's the crucial challenge, and that's what I hope I will convey to you shortly. Is that okay? If I get time. Okay, well, let me crack on. Yeah, okay, well, that was just a bit more about the philosophy, which I think probably I'll skip on in the interest of time. But so Josh Benneler has this very nice way of stating it in the top bullet. So he says what you're really trying to do is verify the election, not the system. Okay, so I mean, one way you could, if you had touchscreens, you could imagine getting hold of the code from Diebold or whatever and trying to do a detailed verification of the 100,000 lines of code or whatever. Convince yourself that everything should work okay. Then, of course, you've still got the problem that even if you've done that, you've got to ensure that the verified code is what's actually running on the day, et cetera, right? So that kind of assurance is, in my view, very fragile, very difficult to achieve. So the goal here is not to have to rely on, say, verification of code, but to set up the election in such a way that as it unfolds, it generates enough evidence that anybody can go and look at this evidence and be convinced that everything is unfolded correctly. And again, I'll hopefully convey, at least in a high level, how that works. And in fact, this idea is kind of summarized as there's a notion that Ron Rivest came up with some years ago that he calls software independence, that the result should be in some sense independent of the correctness of the code. But again, that's something I won't really have time to talk about too much now. Okay, let's crack on. So the sort of indirection, sorry, it's a slightly messy diagram, but it's best I could do by hand. So we have a sort of collection of voters inputting their votes on the bottom left here. They're encrypted in some way, and that's the crucial step that I'll be mostly focusing on. Then they're posted onto a web bulletin board. So the blue bit is supposed to sort of signify this secure web bulletin board. Then they're possibly they go through some sort of mixnet process to anonymize them, and then they're decrypted and can be counted by everyone. Or possibly you use homomorphic properties to sort of add them all under encryption and then just decrypt the result, which obviously immediately gives you anonymity as well. And so out pops the, well, if you use a mixnet, out pop the plain text votes, but in shuffled order, so you can't link them back to the original receipts. So even if you could link the receipts back to the voters to answer your question, the anonymization in the mixes would mean that wouldn't of itself break ballot anonymity. Okay, so that gives you a high-level diagrammatic view of what's the basic idea. Okay, so let me crack on, just very quickly say in very informal terms. Of course, there are lots of papers out there which define these in much more formal terms, but we don't have time for that really. So first of all, a bunch of integrity properties, which I think are sort of mostly fairly obvious. Clearly, we want the result to be correct. We want every voter to be able to confirm that their vote has been accurately recorded, and this is where we go, is partly a response to your question. There's several steps to that. First of all, they need to be sure that their vote is correctly buried in this encryption. Then they have to check that their encrypted receipt appears on the web bulletin board, and then they have to be convinced that their vote, along with all the other encrypted votes, are correctly processed to give the right result in terms of what's the encrypted set of votes posted on the web bulletin board. So there's all three of these steps have to be checked in various ways. And the really tricky bit is that first one, how to convince the voter that their vote is correct. And we'll talk more about that shortly. Universal verifiability. So a distinction is usually made between individual, because that's a verification step that the correct vote is in the ciphertext is really a verification that only the voter themselves can perform. So it has to be individual. Universal properties like universal verifiability are supposed to be things that anybody can check. And so, for example, the tabulation process, once we've got the encrypted set of votes, from then on it should be universal. It should be checkable by anyone in principle. And there's the universal verifiability that I mentioned earlier. Secrecy requirements, well, first of all, well, actually at the outset of voting, people didn't even realize that ballots, voting should be private. Then people started to encounter vote buying and coercion and realized that that's a property you need. Then when people started to think about these cryptographic schemes, they realized that you actually need even more sophisticated notions, because ballot secrecy, if it's just sort of simply phrased, is in a sense just against a sort of passive attacker who just observes the unfolding of the election. But people began to realize that you could have active attackers actually interacting with the voters before, during, and even after the election. So these lead to these much more subtle properties of receipt freeness, which is basically a voter should never be able to construct a proof of how they voted, even though they got a sort of private individual proof at the time of casting, but that's a very sort of ephemeral proof. And non-transferable proof, and furthermore, the even stronger property of coercion resistance, which basically means that even if the coercer can interact with the voter pretty much throughout the entire process, even then voters can still vote the way they want without the coercer being able to tell, which I think I give a slightly more formal definition of this, just to give you an idea of how kind of subtle it is. So my preferred informal statement of this property is, for all coercive strategies, there must exist a strategy for the voter such that they can vote according to their intent, but in a way that the coercer cannot tell that they haven't obeyed the instructions, and in particular to vote the way the coercer required. Okay, that probably sounds a bit of a mouthful, but as far as I can see, to really capture the property properly, you need something as complex and with sort of quantifiers like that. I'll illustrate shortly an example of where, if you don't frame it very carefully, you could have a system which satisfies the definition but is still sort of insecure. We'll come to that, I hope, shortly. Okay, and of course the strategy, the voter's strategy has to be pretty simple for them to understand and execute. So that's another thing. And of course, there's a whole bunch of other properties which I'm not going to go through the details of, but it has to be usable, understandable. It has to be available, so you don't want denial of service attacks. The fourth one actually is quite important. I would actually like to draw attention to that, and it's one which I think recently people are becoming increasingly aware of the importance of. So Ralph Kirsters actually has coined the word accountability for this, but I think it's long gone under the notion of dispute resolution. And I think it echoes an earlier talk about sort of auditability. And the key point that so far I've been talking about being able to detect if there's some sort of cheating going on. But in fact, you want to be able to go beyond that. If you find that some cheating is going on, you really want to be able to diagnose it and figure out which component caused it. And in particular, you can have situations where you might have a dispute, if you like, between the voter. For example, the voter claims, I got this receipt, but I can't find it on the web bulletin board. But if they manage somehow to fake a receipt, that looks like a valid challenge. So you have to be able to make receipts hard to fake and so forth, right? So you have to be able to figure out whether, for example, it's the voter who's trying to undermine the credibility of the election, or whether it's really a problem with the election system. And so this is actually, again, a very tricky property to achieve and a very important one. And, well, there's other properties too, but let's crack on. Okay, so in some sense, once we've got the sort of agreed set of encrypted votes up on the web bulletin board, the rest is sort of fairly straightforward crypto mathematics. I mean, I'm exaggerating. There's a lot of very sophisticated stuff that's gone on there. There's lots of work, for example, trying to get more efficient, more verifiable mixes and so on and so forth. But it's all sort of highly technical and fairly well understood. Yes, so as I said, for example, using mixed nets or homomorphic encryption. Where I feel the real challenges occur are at the edges of the system, where the interface between the technical system and the voters. And that's what I'm going to be focusing on. And in particular, I think that addresses, hopefully will start to address your question, because this is the really delicate bit. So let's just start by illustrating by taking a sort of very naive approach. So the most obvious thing is, let's say we're doing internet voting. So in fact, there's a system called Helios, which some of you may have heard of, where you basically download a Java app, you provide it with your choice of candidate, and it creates an encryption, an Elgamal encryption of that vote, and then sends it off to the web or to the server, and it's posted on the web bulletin board. Okay, so that's a very easy way of trying to implement this notion that I described earlier, this indirection, if you like. But clearly this is very, if just stated like that, it's very naive, because again, we get into this issue, well, how do we know that the device or the app that does this encryption does it correctly? It might substitute a different candidate, produce a ciphertext, and how does the voter tell the difference? So we'll come on to how we try and deal with that in a minute. Well, in fact, there's a bit on the bullet here. The typical way we try to deal with this has now come under the name of Benello challenges. So what you can do is you get the device to encrypt a candidate, and then once it's committed, say in a signed ciphertext or perhaps even a printed output to the encryption of that, you decide whether you want to challenge that encryption or whether you're happy to cast it. Okay, if you challenge it, it basically means that the encryption has to be opened up. So, for example, the randomization has to be revealed so that a checker can, recreate the ciphertext and check that it agrees. Or you can just say, okay, I'm happy with it. I can cast. I'll just cast that ciphertext. And the key point is you can do this repeatedly if you want. And of course, the idea is that the device shouldn't know beforehand whether the voter is going to audit or cast the vote. And so if it does try and cheat, it has a certain probability of being caught. Right? That's a standard way of trying to deal with this. Yeah.
How do you guarantee the integrity of the machine if those programs are running? Hi. How do you guarantee the integrity of the machine where all of these programs are running? As in, someone could have tampered with your machine to basically simulate all these programs and make you believe, that somehow you are shown some that is not what's being sent.
I'm not quite sure I understand it. I mean, the point of these Benello challenges is to try and avoid having to trust the machine, right? So even if it's been corrupted, you're asking it to commit to encryptions. So you can do it sequentially, as I just described, or you could do it in parallel. Maybe it's easier to understand in parallel. Let's say the protocol is the device has to create 10 encryptions of your candidate. Okay, and at that point, you choose 9 of them to audit at random and 1 of them that you will retain to cast. Okay, so all of those encryptions are opened up. So, for example, the device is asked to reveal the randomization it used for each of those encryptions, and then so you need a separate device then to do the audit, right? Oh, okay. You can't do it on the device itself. Perhaps that's the point you were getting at.
So you need to trust some device at some point.
You need
to trust the device that does the auditing, I guess.
Well, there is some degree of trust, but I mean the idea is that you can get the audits of these ballots done on any independent device of your choice, or even a sort of web service or something. So in some sense you can spread the trust, right?
Yeah. Okay.
But we're going to come to other ways of getting the assurance in a second anyway, so don't get too hung up on this. In fact, I'm mentioning this precisely because it is problematic, and it's problematic in precisely these senses. Right? One of the difficulties with Helios is that really, for it to work properly, is that you need to access another independent web service to do the audits. You can't obviously rely on the app itself to do the audits. Yeah. But in a sense, this is just to illustrate the problem. So yeah, the assurance is statistical. It's not very high. It's not a direct assurance for the cast ballot. Obviously, the point is you can't cast an audited ballot because you've broken the secrecy. You've revealed the randomization, for example. So with this kind of technique, you cannot audit directly the ballot that you used to cast. Okay. So I'm not advocating this. I'm sort of throwing it up. As I said, it's a naive approach, if you like. So let me just very quickly touch on a very nice scheme which takes a different approach to this. And again, I'm not going to go into the technical details, but I'll just try and give you a flavor of it. So it's originally due to Andy Neff, but then it was elaborated by Benedita and Roy Joachim. So you basically get a receipt which has a list of all the candidates, and you will tell the device which candidate you want. And basically the device is supposed to produce an encryption of a 1 against the candidate of choice and an encryption of 0 against all the other candidates. And so this is actually an in-person, in-booth scheme. So in the booth, the voter actually goes through an interactive zero-knowledge proof with a device which is supposed to prove and produces a transcript of the fact that it encrypted a 1 against the candidate of choice. Okay, but what the really clever trick is, the device also produces a fake proof transcript that it's encrypted a 1 against all the other candidates. But these, of course, are fakes, so they're not interactive. And only the voter knows which one was the real, the one that it really interacted with. Okay, and it also provides a proof that there is only one encrypted in this set. Okay, so you get a picture a bit like this. Right, so the vote is for Benjamin, so there's an encryption of a 1 there. There's a real the transcript of the real interactive proof with the voter against that, and then it'll produce fake transcripts of proofs against the others. So anybody seeing this receipt later cannot tell what it actually represents. Is that sort of clear to everyone? Depends perhaps on how much crypto background you have, but so this is very ingenious. But it's also not terribly usable, right? I mean, you can, again, I won't go through the details, but the voter actually does have to sort of issue a challenge to the device in the booth to create this interactive proof and so forth. So it's not a trivial process for the voter. So very ingenious, but, well, the company that they founded trying to set this up has sunk without trace. So I think usability killed that otherwise very beautiful idea. Okay, well, let me come on to my own approach to this, which is the Prêt à voter. So again, this gives a different way of trying to address this particular problem. So it basically uses paper printed ballots, so fairly familiar in most contexts, certainly in the UK. But the key point about Prêt à voter is that rather than having, as typically you would have a sort of fixed candidate order on each ballot form, in Prêt à voter each ballot form has an independently randomized order of the candidates. Okay, so these are created, well, typically in advance, printed in advance, although there are variants, you can do it on demand, but let's not get into that right now. And so there is also information defining the candidate order is encrypted and sort of printed on the ballot form, or perhaps more likely committed to the web bulletin board with a sort of pointer on the ballot form to it. So you get something a bit like this. And I always like to use asterisk characters just to show the French origins of the name. Okay, so if you got if the voter picked up another one, they would be sealed in envelopes for secrecy. You'd see typically a different order of the candidates down the left-hand side. Okay, so they take it into the booth, take it out of its protective envelope. They mark, panoramics in this case. And then they detach the left-hand side and somehow destroy it in the booth. Okay? Did you like that? That's the wonders of Keynote. It took me about an hour to get that to work. Okay, and now this is the receipt. Okay, now hopefully it's sort of fairly clear to everyone that as long as you've destroyed that left-hand side, and as long as the keys and so on that encrypt the candidate order are suitably protected, nobody seeing this receipt can tell what it represents as a candidate choice. Does that make sense? Okay. Now let me see. Oh yeah. Okay. And so, this wasn't actually the inspiration of the idea, or at least not consciously, but I suppose it could have been. I just thought I'd quickly show you that. So the voting ceremony I think I've described, but I think, yeah. You might be asking the question that I'm just about to try and answer, but yeah, go on. Yeah.
On your ballot form, there were 5 candidates, so there are 120 permutations, I think, of these 5 candidates. Right. So there are 120 different variants of the ballot form. Now, I just I make sure I get say something like 500 of these envelopes unopened, and at home I check which of the 120 permutations bears the number 7490012. The number
I know where
that
you're
you
going,
had on the bottom.
but you're assuming that it's a deterministic encryption algorithm, I think, right? But it won't be. I mean, yes, that's a good point. It's crucial that you use a randomizing probabilistic algorithm, so like El-Gamal or something. Okay, so that won't work, right? What I thought you were going to ask is, well, okay, that's all very well, but how does the voter still know that the correct candidate is in there? And I think I have a... Well, let me say it now. I think there's a slide a bit later that talks about it. So again, we have to try and audit the system to catch if it's cheating. So in the case of Prêt, the way the system might try and cheat, of course, is to create badly formed ballots, where the candidate order printed in clear down the left-hand side doesn't agree with the order that's buried in the ciphertext. Okay, or to put it the other way around, if all the ballots are well formed, in the sense that there is a consistency between the candidate order printed on the form and the order buried in the ciphertext, then as long as the voter puts the cross in the right place, they know that the receipt will encode the correct candidate. Okay, so the crucial thing is to try and verify that all of these ballots are correctly well formed in this sense. And so what we can do is basically just choose ballot forms at random, either the voter or perhaps independent auditing authorities, choose ballot forms at random and require that they be opened up and checked that they are well formed in the sense that I just described. Okay, so that should be the source of confidence to the voter that their votes are correctly encoded. And this has a number of nice features. It means, for example, I alluded to this dispute resolution issue earlier. So if you use the Benello challenge process that I was talking about before, so you have a device which creates on-demand encryptions of the candidate. Now, of course, the voter might catch it if it audits, if it tries to cheat, and the ballot is audited or the receipt is audited. But then, of course, you have the problem, so the voter then goes and complains, and now you don't quite know whether it's the system, the device that encrypted incorrectly, or whether the voter is lying about what candidate they input into the voting device. Okay, the nice thing about Prêt is that doesn't arise, right? The ballot form is either well-formed or it's not, and that's completely independent of any claims that the voter may be making. So that's one nice thing I would like to stress. Okay, so I think I've described the voting ceremony. We have to crack on. The receipt, well, that's fairly sort of technical. I think we can skip that. Okay, so I probably made a few of these remarks. So I think it's hopefully clear to everyone that the receipt conceals the vote. The voting experience is actually sort of fairly reasonably familiar, at least to UK voters anyway. I'm not quite sure about others. Another nice feature is that you'll notice that the voter doesn't have to communicate their choice to any device. So that immediately sidesteps a whole bunch of sort of potential side channels like the ETAPS machines. Later on, the receipt is scanned by a device for uploading to the web bulletin board, but of course at that point it's already encrypted, so that scanning device cannot leak any useful information. In fact, it just gets public information. The other bullets I think I've said. Oh yes, and of course you can also have other voting systems like ranked voting, approval voting and so on. You can also encode quite nicely. Okay. And as I mentioned earlier, it's nice because it doesn't have side channels. So let me make one interesting remark. So I mentioned Mark Pledge earlier. Now that had a lot of very nice features. So one drawback with Prêt is that you have to guarantee the destruction of the left-hand side. Right? One potential sort of coercion strategy is the coercer says, well, don't actually destroy the left-hand side, smuggle it out and show it to me afterwards. So that is a vulnerability that we have to worry about. How do we try and prevent that happening? So that's one drawback. I've spoken about some advantages of the Prêt approach. That's a drawback. Mark Pledge doesn't have that, right? If you think back to the way Mark Pledge worked, you don't have to destroy any information to conceal the vote. The way the vote is concealed is by a sort of masking process, if you like, by spurious information. So one of the challenges, which I'll throw out, I was going to mention it at the end, is there any way we can combine these nice features of both Prêt and Mark Pledge together? That would be really cool if we could do that, but I've not been able to come up with a way of doing it. Okay, so I really need to crack on quickly, I think. Okay, so that was, I knew there was a slide a bit later, so that talks about how you do the audits of ballots to give yourself the confidence that your vote is correctly encrypted as long as your ballot is well formed. Okay, dispute resolution, I think I've already said. Okay, let me just say a few words. Again, I've already alluded to this, but one of the common themes which crops up in just about all these systems is the notion of a secure web bulletin board. Okay, so the idea is it should be append only, and it should be, in a sense, it's a secure broadcast, so everybody should get a consistent view of the contents. So quite how you would implement such a thing is still not entirely clear. There's a number of suggestions in the literature. Time permitting, I'll touch on a nice one that was used in Victoria State, developed by Surrey University. But that's still a bit of an open question, how to really achieve the properties of this rather fictional notion of a web bulletin board. So you can read lots of papers with these schemes, and pretty much all of them say, well, we assume the existence of a secure web bulletin board. So it's still a bit open how you do it. Okay, actually this I think I've more or less covered, so I better skip on quickly. So I think this puts the steps of the argument together. Okay, so for a voter to be convinced with Prêt that their vote is actually counted, they need to be confident that their ballot form was well formed in the sense that I mentioned, and that hopefully is achieved by doing random audits, as many random audits as you feel you need. Then you have to check that your receipt appears on the web bulletin board, and then you have the universal verifiability of the set of encrypted votes subsequently. Okay, so again, I'm not going to say too much about this. I already alluded to this. There's sort of fairly standard techniques to confirm, to hopefully sort of universal satisfaction, that the batch of encrypted votes are correctly treated, anonymized, and decrypted and tabulated. So to guarantee the result is correct, but while maintaining ballot privacy. So, okay, so that's just a quick slide about homomorphic tabulation. Most people here sort of moderately familiar with some crypto algorithms and what homomorphic encryption means. So some particularly public key crypto systems have very nice algebraic properties. So for example, RSA, some of you know about that. If you take the product of the RSA encryption of two plain texts, what you basically get is the encryption of the product of them. Okay, El-Gamal has a similar sort of structure. If you take exponential El-Gamal, you put the plain text up as an exponent. You can have a rather nice property that if you take the product of two exponential El-Gamal ciphertexts, what you get is the El-Gamal encryption, the exponential El-Gamal encryption of the sum of the plain text. And that kind of property is obviously and Pallier also has that structure immediately. And particularly that kind of algebraic property is very useful obviously for voting, because adding up votes is precisely what you want to do. So the algorithms with this kind of algebraic structure are sort of ideal for doing tabulation, adding up of votes under encryption, and then you can just encrypt the result at the end. So again, I won't say too much more about that. So yeah. Okay, so well, Prêt has gone through quite a lot of evolution steps. There's a whole bunch of papers that describe this. I don't have time to go through it all. I'll just mention at the end, and this applies not just to Prêt à voter. I mean, one of the issues that comes up quite a lot is it would be very nice if you could get some kind of unconditional everlasting privacy property. Now you can see with Prêt à voter, as for example I've described it, or Helios, if at some later date El Gamal is broken by a quantum computer or something in 20 years' time, people might be worried about this prospect. So these kind of schemes don't immediately give you everlasting privacy, and there are people who are seriously worried about this. And some thought has been given to how you can transform systems to try and provide unconditional everlasting privacy, but that typically comes at a cost of the verifiability. So you tend to lose the unconditional sort of verifiability properties, so you have to trade one off against the other. That, again, is an interesting line of research, but again, I don't really have time to get into that. Okay, again, I think I'll skip that. There are various ways you can design decisions you can take with Prêt à voter and other systems. So, for example, you could wonder whether it's best to pre-print the ballot forms, as I sort of described earlier, or is it better to create them on demand at the polling station? There are trade-offs between this, interesting trade-offs, which actually would be very interesting to have a nice way of measuring and comparing the security strength. So there's various design decisions like that, ways you could choose to go. There are various threats. A lot of these apply not just to Prêt à voter, but sort of systems in this class in general. I'm not going to go through the details of all of them. The retention of the right-hand side I mentioned earlier, so this is the issue about trying to enforce the destruction of the candidate list. So that's one problem. You need to find ways of doing that. Or alternatively, perhaps a more subtle way is actually not so much to enforce the destruction, but to sort of conceal what is the left-hand side by maybe in the booth you could have a pile of dummy candidate orders. So the voter could potentially take out a different one which would satisfy the coercer. So there are various ways you can think about trying to counter that sort of threat. The randomization attack is actually a very interesting one. It takes me back to this definition of coercion resistance. So let me touch on that because I think it's an interesting point. So hopefully you can see that, at least intuitively, I haven't proved it to you, that Prêt à voter provides for example, ballot privacy and coercion resistance, and certainly receipt freeness, right? The voter doesn't have a proof, assuming that the keys remain secret and so forth, cannot prove to a third party how they voted. So you might think that, okay, that's fine, so that leads to coercion resistance. But in fact, it turns out that there's a rather unpleasant, subtle style of attack. The coercer just says, okay, well, I'm not particularly interested in finding out how you vote, but when you go into the booth, you must come out with a receipt with a cross in the first position, let's say. Okay? And this is really annoying, right? Because it means it isn't a violation of ballot privacy because the coercer doesn't know as a result how you voted, but if he's managed to force your vote to be sort of randomized, at least in a simple implementation. Okay, so hopefully that sort of illustrates how very careful you have to be in your definitions, right? If you don't get it quite right, you can have a system which satisfies your property but is still open to attack. There are, of course, psychological attacks. Perhaps that's worth mentioning, right? So this speaks to the whole issue of sort of trust and understanding, right? You can imagine coercers who say, well, you can show me your receipt and I can actually read your candidate off it. Now, that's probably not true, almost certainly not true, but if a sufficient number of voters believe it, they will still be influenced by that kind of claim. So that's difficult. That potentially could be a real showstopper for these kind of schemes. Okay, well, I need to crack on quickly. So let me just quickly, as promised, mention a few sort of rival competitor schemes. So there's a very nice scheme called Scantegrity, or Scantegrity 2, or you can read that as Invisible Ink. It's, I think, a deliberate sort of pun, which is primarily due to Schaum. Let me try to just very quickly describe it in words. So again, you get a paper receipt. The candidates come in a fixed order. But the key trick is that against each candidate, So it's a system which is designed to be backward compatible with optical scan ballots in the US. And so in these ballots, you have a paper ballot, and you fill in a blob, a little circle against your candidate. Have you seen these kind of things? Maybe not in Massachusetts or whatever. And that's fed into an optical reader, which reads the position of the blob. What David suggested is that in addition to just sort of filling in the blob, there is some invisible codes are printed in these blobs. And the voter is given a special invisible ink revealing pen. So they fill out the blob, which sort of blackens the blob, but it also reveals a code, a random code. But the other codes should remain secret. And the idea is the voter can record this code, on a piece of paper or whatever, and they can use it later to check things on the web bulletin board. And I won't go into all the sort of technicalities of how it works underneath, but the beauty of this is again, it's a response to this issue about the dispute resolution, right? Because again, you have this issue, a voter might go to the web bulletin board, claim that he can't find his receipt or he can't find his code. Now, the beauty of this trick in this context is, if a voter says, I've checked the web bulletin board and the code that's up there isn't the one that I recorded, now he has a kind of proof, because these are random and fairly sparse. So you can check, that the claimed code is not on the web bulletin board, and then there's a procedure for revealing all the valid codes for that ballot, for that receipt. And if the voter is claiming one which is not amongst the valid set, then it's probably a spurious complaint. But if it is a valid one and not the one that's on the web bulletin board, then it is probably a valid complaint, right? So it's a nice trick. Okay, Mark Pledge I've mentioned earlier. Ron Revest has a very nice scheme called 3Ballot, which is a beautiful idea. Maybe in question time I can say a bit more about it, but from a usability point of view, it's pretty bad. The voter actually has to, as the name implies, to cast 3 separate ballots, and there's quite a complicated voting rule. They essentially cast 2 votes for the candidate of their choice and 1 vote for all the others. There's no encryption going on, which is the beauty of it. And then when you tabulate things, everything is put on the web bulletin board. You add up all the votes, and then you subtract the number of voters from each total, and you get the number of votes cast. So it's very ingenious, but it's very hard to use. Okay, so just to talk quickly about internet schemes. So I've already mentioned Helios, which I was kind of a bit critical of, but it's actually probably the best, more or less the best scheme out there at the moment. With Vanessa Teague, I also came up with a thing called Pretty Good Democracy, which I might have time to mention very quickly, and Selini at the end. I think in time I better skip over the others. Whoops, I go backwards. Yes, sorry. Okay, let me just spend a minute or two then talking about Prêt going down under then. So this was a project which was commissioned by the Victoria Electoral Commission. It was done in conjunction with people at University of Surrey, particularly Steve Schneider and others, and also Vanessa Teague at the University of Melbourne. So it was actually successfully used in November 2014 for, I think it was lower house elections. It was quite an experience being involved in this, but again, I won't talk about that too much now. So originally it actually sounded like a very ambitious project, because potentially you have 6 million voters in Victoria State. We actually designed the system to be scalable up to several 100,000 potentially. In Australia, they have extremely complex ballots that you can have sort of 40, 50 candidates on a ballot form quite easily, and furthermore, they have a single transferable vote scheme. So in principle, a voter could fill in a ranking, an ordered ranking, 1 through 40 or 50 or something on the ballot form. So it's technically very complex to deal with, and we were also asked to provide usability, accessibility properties for it. In the event, the number of voters who actually used it was far smaller than we anticipated. The VEC, I guess, deliberately sort of constrained its use very heavily. It was used by about 500 people at the the High Commission, the Australian High Commission in London. As I was mentioning, I guess over coffee or something, Australians are actually obliged. It's a legal obligation to vote. So they're given an option to go to the High Commission in London. They were allowed to use this machine, and about 500 of them did. And then about 600 or 700 others used it in so-called early voting stations in Victoria State. So just to emphasize again, it's not an internet scheme, it's an in-person voting system, an adaptation of Prêt à voter. So I think one of the lessons that came out of this is that if you're dealing with election officials and so forth, they put all kinds of requirements on you which as a security person you're typically not very happy with. So first off, for usability reasons, we felt obliged to use a touchscreen interface for the user. And you can imagine that if you're having to fill in a ranking on 50 candidates presented to you in a random order, that's really not going to be very usable. So in the context certainly of Australia, it seems you're pretty much forced for usability reasons to use a touchscreen. And of course that immediately undermines one of the nice properties that I spoke about earlier, Prêt à voter, of not having to communicate to a device your choice. So that immediately opens up all kinds of side channel issues. So that's not something we were not very comfortable with, but we didn't feel we could really argue with the usability requirement. And in fact, things got a little bit worse. In the original Prêt à voter, the idea was, as I say, you filled in your paper, you destroyed the left-hand side, and then you took it to a scanner. Now the VEC said, okay, well, the machine actually knows your vote. Why can't it just post it immediately to the web bulletin board? So this device, it got even worse because it was now an online device which learnt the voter's choice. So, very uncomfortable security compromises. Yeah, well, you get the picture. It gets worse, but I won't labor it. On the other hand, I think there were some nice innovations, so let me be positive up on this. Again, for sort of practical reasons, we had to go away from the pre-printed approach and go for a print-on-demand approach. So in the polling station, this is partly because people are supposed to be allowed to vote from any polling station anywhere throughout the state. And because, in fact, there are different ballots for different counties or whatever they call them, districts, I guess, you actually it wasn't practical, to distribute sufficient for every possible contingency of distribution of voters and so on. So we had to actually have a capability to print them on demand. So there's some quite nice innovations there. So, for example, we had a way of distributed generation of the randomization to try and counter sort of cryptographic and subliminal attacks and distribute those in a verifiable way. One particularly interesting innovation, which I say a little bit more in the next slide, is in the web bulletin board. So Steve Schneider in particular came up with a very nice distributed peer Byzantine tolerant kind of design for that, which had a further feature that when a receipt is cast, it was actually threshold signed by a threshold set of the peers. So you actually got a digital signature as a sort of verification that your vote had actually been registered by a threshold set of the trustees. So as long as you trust a threshold set, then that sort of gave you a guarantee, which you could later, of course, double check on the web bulletin board, but that your vote had actually, your receipt had been recorded. So that's very nice. If you're interested in that kind of stuff, I would certainly point you to that paper. The voting ceremony, I think I'll skip on for time. Okay, well, the compromise, as I've kind of alluded to already, you lose the nice property that the voter, you have this property, the voter has to communicate their choice to the device. And furthermore, the device in this case was actually connected to the web, which is nasty. Okay, so there's the slide which just sort of describes a little bit about Steve's approach to the web bulletin board. So I think this is very nice and could well be useful in other schemes. And particularly this idea of getting a threshold signature back when your receipt has been registered by by a threshold set of trustees, that's a very nice trick. Okay, I'll skip the details of that. Okay, so I guess I have about 15 minutes left. So let me just quickly turn to some internet voting issues. So far, basically, I've been talking, at least implicitly, about in-person voting, right? So you vote in the privacy of a booth, in person at a polling station. Now, of course, there's quite a lot of demand to move to internet voting, and this introduces a whole host of new problems. Clearly, you have potentially insecure devices, as I think someone was alluding earlier. You have all the intrinsic insecurities of the internet and potential for denial of service attacks. And of course, you've got all these sort of coercion problems because you can no longer guarantee the isolation of the voter at the time that they actually sort of cast their vote or create their receipt or whatever. So this is fiendishly difficult. But people have been trying to provide solutions to this. Just to make my position clear, I and I think quite a lot of my colleagues in this area don't think that we have any scheme or technology at the moment which will allow us to conduct serious elections online. And so we'd seriously advise against running anything. There are, of course, companies out there who are providing solutions that they even claim are end-to-end verifiable, but they've just adopted the term because it sounds good. When you look at the systems, they're certainly not end-to-end verifiable. So this is quite a serious area of contention. And there are some places that are actually using internet voting seriously, like Estonia and so on. And, well, I think that's extremely dangerous. But anyway, that's enough of that. So one approach, at least to try and get over some of the insecurities of the client devices and the internet, is a very simple trick, which David Schaum came up with quite some time back, called code vote, typically called code voting. So the idea is each voter gets through, say, the mail, an individual code sheet, so that it has a set of random codes against each candidate. So, I mean, you can probably imagine the rest. So it would look perhaps a bit like this. It might also include a column of acknowledgement codes. Okay, so to vote, you log on to the server, perhaps authenticating yourself in some way. You then provide the code for your chosen candidate. And of course, ideally, the system should respond with an ACK code that you can check corresponds to the correct one on your code sheet. So that gives you some assurance that at least the server, and presumably the genuine server, received your vote code. Of course, what happens after that really is a question of trust. Okay, but at least it helps a little bit. Okay, I think I've said that. So let me just very quickly mention in passing a scheme that, as I say, Vanessa Teague and I came up with some years ago, which tries to slightly improve the situation. So the trick here is very simple. It is basically code voting, but with the changes, rather than envisaging a voting server which has a database of all these secret codes, we actually secret share the information of these codes. So that now, rather than just a single server accepting these codes and sending back the ACK codes, a threshold set of them have to cooperate, okay, to register the code and then decrypt the acknowledgement code in a threshold fashion. Okay, so now when you get hopefully the correct acknowledgement code back, that gives you a slightly stronger assurance that a threshold set of these trustees have registered your code on the web bulletin board, and then there are procedures sort of guarantee that subsequently gets correctly tabulated, rather as before. So I won't say too much more about that. And yes, for receipt freeness, so there's an example. Again, you have a design decision. You could send back individual acknowledgement codes for each candidate, but that's sort of potentially dangerous for coercion, because if there's a coercive watching over your shoulder, he can see the code that comes back to you. So we actually decided to have a single confirmation code, which you can see the sort of second line to the bottom. So that avoids some of those coercion threats, but it does mean that now you have to trust that these codes are kept secret. right? So fundamental to this is the assumption that, for example, your device doesn't get to learn any codes apart from the one that you input to it. Okay, so again, that's kind of sparse, so it should be very difficult for it to ship off a valid alternative code. But if somehow this database of codes is compromised, then of course, or either your device or a man in the middle could substitute an alternative valid code that gets registered. It's valid, so it gets registered, and the confirmation code comes back. So Pretty Good Democracy has this difficulty that obviously the confidentiality of the vote is compromised if these codes are leaked, but in fact the integrity is potentially leaked as well. So that's just to flag up that caveat. That's arguably a serious problem with it. Well, in the interest of time, I'll skip over the details of how it works in the background. Okay, well, let me just quickly say a few things about attempts to achieve coercion resistance with internet voting. So I think the first sort of serious attempt to do this is usually referred to as JCJ, so that's Jules, Catalano, and Jacobson. So they came up with a scheme. Well, in fact, they came up with definitions of some of these properties, and then came up with a scheme which achieves some of these properties. And again, I don't have time to go into the details, but the basic idea is quite simple. The voters are provided in some way with credentials, which are sort of random-looking codes. And encryptions of these real credentials are posted to the web bulletin board. Now, there has to be some process to sort of guarantee to the voter when they sort of register and are provided with these codes that what they've been given is a real one, in the sense that an encryption of it sits on the web bulletin board. And of course that again has to be a proof which they can't transfer to a third party. So quite how that's achieved is kind of delicate, but again I won't go into the details too much of it now. So the idea of course is if you're not coerced, you cast your vote providing your real credential to your device. So what in fact happens is that encryption of your code and your credential is posted to the web bulletin board. If you're being coerced, you of course just claim you make up some fake code, because they're just on the surface of it, they're random looking strings of numbers. The coercer cannot tell whether it's real or fake. But the point is that if a vote is cast with a fake credential, it doesn't get counted subsequently. Basically what happens is that so-called plain text equivalence tests are run later at the tabulation stage, which will pull out votes which are cast with valid credentials, and any with fake credentials are just binned. But this is done after sort of mixing and anonymization, so the coercer cannot tell which encrypted votes have been dropped. Does that at a high level sort of make sense? So it's kind of an idea of a sort of alarm code. At ATMs, if you're being coerced, you can put in an alarm code and the thing comes back saying, sorry, service not available at the moment, and alerts the authorities that you're being coerced, or you've forgotten your ATM, your PIN code, I suppose, but anyway. And there's a slightly more sophisticated system which was developed in Cornell, which is actually available as a service, which is called Civitas, which sort of builds on this. And in particular, it addresses this issue of how do you provide essentially what's called a designated verifier proof to the voter when the real credential is delivered to them. But again, we don't have time really to go into too many details. Okay, well, let me just very quickly try and wind up with one last thing, which I promised. So this is this new scheme that I've been working on for the last year or so, called Selini. So all I've been describing here is kind of very nice, at least from a theoretical point of view. Now hopefully I've convinced you that these systems have some nice properties of voter verification, coercion resistance, and so on. But of course, this process of having to handle an encrypted receipt and check it on the web bulletin board and so on and so forth, and believe that audits you do, whatever, will guarantee that your vote is correctly encrypted. That this is all kind of a strain for voters, both in terms of usability and credibility, and so on and so forth. So it'd be nice if we could come up with some simpler way of achieving the same sort of goals. So this is what Selini tries to do, and I called it that just as a sort of homage to Helios, if you like. But anyway. So the idea is very simple. It goes back to an old and very simple idea. Well, why not just give voters private tracker numbers? And then you post on the web bulletin board votes in the clear with the tracker numbers against them, right? So you just look up your vote using your tracker number and check that the right vote in the clear, not encrypted now, is on the web bulletin board. So wouldn't that be so much simpler and more straightforward? So, I mean, that has been suggested in the past. So the web bulletin board now might look a bit like that. Now, there's some obvious downsides, difficulties with this, and up until now, the community hasn't really taken this kind of thing seriously, presumably because of these problems. So, first, we have to guarantee that voters all get distinct tracker numbers. Right? Clearly, if you give the same tracker number to two voters, they're going to end up checking the same thing, and if you know that they're likely to vote the same way, you just post one item against that tracker number on the web bulletin board. They're both happy, and you get to ballot stuff another vote in its place with another tracker number. And of course, we have to keep the association of the tracker numbers to voters secret, because if we don't, we immediately open up coercion problems. And of course, that's also very tricky, because the obvious coercion attack, well, I guess it's on the next slide. Yeah, the coercer just says, well, before the election, tell me what your tracker number is, and then of course he can look up on the web bulletin board just as easily as you can. So actually the background to this is I was having a bit of a kind of dispute with one of my colleagues in Luxembourg about, we actually ran an election using Helios, and afterwards he was complaining, in a sense, exactly your point, I can't see my vote in the clear, so how do I verify anything? And I tried to explain to him, well, it has to be like that to avoid coercion, and he said, okay, well, in that case it's not verifiable, so he had his own definition of verifiable. And it's in arguing with him that I sort of found myself revisiting this old idea. And I was, I guess, kind of rehearsing the arguments as to why a simple tracker number system like this wouldn't really be viable, at least from coercion point of view. And then it struck me, well, actually, we can make the situation better, because and I guess most people have been assuming that the tracker number is delivered to the voter before they cast their vote. But actually, they don't need it to cast their vote, right? They just need it later in verification. So how about we notify voters of their tracker numbers after votes have been cast and put on the web bulletin board, and now if you've been coerced, you have an opportunity to look up an alternative tracker number that points to the coercer's vote. Right? So quite a simple thought. So that's basically the idea. So to come up with a scheme which first of all guarantees that every voter will get a unique, distinct tracker number, and then notify them in a way which provides them a high assurance that it's, in a appropriate sense, the correct tracker for them, and that effectively means that it's one that's been committed to them on the web bulletin previously, which I'll describe in a second. But it has to be in a way that's deniable, so that they can still claim an alternative tracker number if they're being lent on by a coercer. And of course, we want to do it in a distributed way which doesn't trust any individual object. So I think I can probably in a few minutes just skim through the basic ideas. Yeah, have I got a few minutes? Yeah. I guess we started a few minutes late, right? Okay, so the setup, excuse me, is a sort of standard El-Gamal encryption context, right? So you have a large group, a generator of a large group, discrete logs and decisional Diffie-Hellman and so believed to be hard and so on and so forth. We assume that there's a threshold election public key, and we'll assume that voters have signing keys, and they also have a trapdoor key, purpose of which I'll explain in a second. And basically our goal is to set things up on the web bulletin board in the following way. So for each voter, there should be, if you like, a row on the web bulletin board. So the first item can be the public key of the voter, so that's a kind of identifier for the voter. Then there should be an encryption of a tracker number under the authority threshold key, and then there's a trapdoor commitment to that tracker number, the same tracker number, alongside it. Okay, and the second item will be used in the tabulation, and the third item will be used in the notification. And I'll try and go through this very quickly. The construction is actually, by standards of these systems, is remarkably simple, really. So the first trick to achieve the uniqueness of all the trackers is we just generate a set of trackers in public and we post them on the web bulletin board so everybody can see that there are distinct numbers. And then we encrypt them, Elgamal encrypt them, a probabilistic encryption algorithm. And then we put them through a verified mixnet. Okay, so because it's verified, we guarantee that we retain the original set of plain text trackers. And once we've done that, then we can basically assign them in this now randomized order to the voters. Okay, so what we've achieved with this is each voter has, at least in encrypted form, a unique tracker assigned to them and in such a way that nobody knows the association. Okay, so quite simple, that bit. So I guess that's basically described there. Then the next bit, and again I think I'll skip on how this is done in a distributed way, but we basically want to get this third term, right, which is the trapdoor commitment. We basically want terms of this form. So we have g to the power of this tracker number, which is assigned to will be assigned to voter I. And then we have hi is basically g to the xi. So xi is this trapdoor which is held by voter I, right? So that's a secret trapdoor key known only to the voter. So this, people who know about this kind of thing, it looks very much like a Pedersen, so-called Pedersen commitment. Okay, so there's a random RI is generated in a distributed way for each voter, and so these terms are now created and posted to the web bulletin board. But I'll skip on the distributed construction. Yeah, so this I can give you pointers to the paper that describes this in more detail. So basically we end up with three terms of this form, right? So we have the public key of the voter, the encryption of his tracker, or more precisely G to the tracker, and then we have this commitment, this trapdoor commitment to the tracker. And it's all done in a way that to guarantee that this should be well formed in the sense that, for example, the NIs in the encryption and the commitment should match. But again, I don't have time to go into the details of that. So let's just try and wind up very quickly. So voting is sort of fairly straightforward, fairly standard for these kind of schemes. The voter, inputs their vote to their device, which creates a signed encryption of their vote. It has to be plain text aware for reasons that Veronique will understand if she's still here. It's posted to the web bulletin board in the appropriate row, right against the voter's identity. The signatures and the plain text awareness proofs are checked, and if they're not valid, they're thrown away. Once we've got that, we pull out the pairs. So the encryption of the tracker and the encryption of the vote are pulled out as a pair, and they're now put through a verified parallel re-encryption mix for the sort of anonymity, and then their threshold verified decrypted at the end. So at the end we get precisely the goal that I mentioned earlier. We get the tracker numbers and the votes in clear, but in a shuffled order. So we can't link them back to the voters' identities. And so that's the point where we can make this public. Voters can go check this. They can identify an alternative tracker if they need it. And let me just now try and wind up in the next minute or two. This I think is the nice bit. So now we need to notify the voters of their real tracker. And what we actually do here is we send to the voter the G to the RI term. So skip the extra terms there. We basically, in a way, I won't describe the details, but we send G to the RI to the voter. So this was previously kept secret, in fact, in a secret shared fashion. And now once the voter or their device has this, they can put it together with the commitment term to form effectively an Elgamal encryption under their secret trapdoor key of their tracker. So they can decrypt it and extract their tracker, And what's nice about this construction is there are sort of two aspects to this. The obvious question to ask is, well, can't the system cheat, fool the voter by sending the wrong G to the RI to them? Well, it turns out that that should be intractable, because if you don't know the trapdoor, it should be intractable to compute an alternative G to the RI, which will open up that encryption to an alternative valid tracker. You can reduce it to DDH, basically. So it should be very hard for an attacker to fool a voter in that sense. But then the flip side is, on the other hand, if you have the trapdoor, it's very easy to fake such a term, which when you put it in to form the Elgamal encryption will open to an alternative valid tracker of your choice. Okay, so that's the basic idea. Did that sort of make sense? Some of you with a sort of crypto background, it will have made sense. Hopefully to others, you get the flavor of it, right? What we're, again, to repeat, what we're trying to do is find a way of notifying the voters after things have appeared on the web bulletin board in a high assurance way. In other words, in a way which they should feel confident that what has been revealed to them is their true assigned tracker, but in a way that they can fake opening to an alternative tracker if they need to. Okay, so the rest is sort of cryptographic details of how that's done. Okay, well, I should really wind up. That's, I think, just states those properties. Okay, so I'll skip that. Okay, well, let me just, yeah. There is a problem which I won't talk about. Some of you may have spotted that there is a difficulty here. If the coercer is himself one of the voters, you might, by chance, right, you're being coerced, you pull off an alternative tracker, you might actually hit on the coercer's tracker number. Or perhaps even more dangerous, the coercer might simply claim that the tracker number you're claiming to him is actually his tracker number, so he knows it can't be the true one. I won't go into the details of how we try and solve that. We think we have a decent solution to that, but we don't have time to talk about it. And at least one person has left already, so... Okay, so I think that's quite a nice scheme. It doesn't provide complete coercion resistance, but I think arguably it provides a nice balance between transparency of verification and reasonable degree of coercion resistance. So, let me just try and conclude. I thought I had to... Whoops. Okay, so conclusions. So, I hope I've managed rather hastily to persuade you that this is a fascinating area for research. It's highly socio-technical, very challenging. There are lots of delicate security requirements which are hard to formulate, lots of tricky threat models to investigate. I was actually talking to Vitaly over lunch, and I was describing some of this work, and he said, well, it seems like it's the hardest problem in security, and maybe arguably that's quite spot on. Just mention a few open questions. So I think it's still open. I'm sure there's scope to come up with schemes which make verification simpler and more understandable. In a sense, that's what Selini was trying to do. But again, I don't think I would recommend Selini to be used on serious, internet voting, for government elections or whatever. There are still challenges of how do we convey trust in these systems. We might think, after we've analyzed them, that they're trustworthy, but that doesn't mean that people will feel confident, will understand them sufficiently to trust them. We still don't really know how to do kind of, if you like, system-based analysis. We know pretty much how to analyze the cryptographic core of these systems, but understanding the system as a whole, including the interactions of coercers and voters, how can we model the kind of attacks that arise from that aspect of the problem is still something which is very poorly understood, I think. I think it's actually a question, can we ever make internet voting sufficiently secure? Achieve sufficient levels of verifiability, coercion resistance, and usability? Can we achieve them all simultaneously to a sufficient degree? I think it's an open question. We don't have a theorem which says it's not possible, but then of course we don't really have a formal definition of what usability really means. But in any case, I would say we don't have any system which can currently do it, and I can't envisage, how long it's going to be before we might reach such a stage. And I alluded to the combination of Mark Pledge and Prêt as a rather more precise challenge earlier. Okay, so I'm done. I've overshot a little bit, sorry. So, thank you for your attention. Comments, questions?
So we may have time for one or two questions.
Have I still not answered your question? Oh, it's a different question.
You already alluded to the bulletin board not, this being a mythological beast.
Yeah.
How can the voter get any assurance that the voting system is what has written the stuff on the bulletin board? Is that a straightforward problem? How does a voter know that that has been written by the election system and not some other?
So your question is, how do you know that
as a voter,
everything that's on the web bulletin board was put there by the...
Yeah.
Well, that kind of relates, I think, to the earlier question about ballot stuffing. So, first off, each voter has this opportunity to check that their receipt appears there. That of itself doesn't, of course, prevent other things being written, additional things. So I sort of talked about that a little bit earlier. So if all the voters have signing keys, then that's one way of trying to guarantee that everything that appears there, comes from a genuine source, i.e., a valid voter. If you don't have that, then you need other mechanisms, and I'm not sure people have thought through all the details or documented all the details of sort of access control and so on that you might apply. I mean, typically, I guess you would make sure that only the election authority or the servers, only they can post things to the web bulletin board, but then, of course, everybody has read access. So you need that kind of access control, I guess, typically. Does that partly answer your question?
Even if I have access control, I don't know that the electoral authority is the only person who could have written that.
Well, if you do have an access control which enforces that, then... Have I misunderstood your question?
Can this be proven?
Well, right. I mean, enforcing that...
So, can the election authority prove to every voter that the authority is the only person having right access?
Well, you can certainly digitally sign everything that appears, with the election authority's signature. So that should be one way of achieving a guarantee, as well as perhaps some access control. You probably want access control additionally as well, because you don't want the web bulletin board flooded with spurious stuff, posted by other people. Yeah, I think there was a question just there.
You said that the last thing you discussed, the Selini 2 scheme, is not recommended by you for realistic elections. I actually wanted to know why. You said it's not fully coercion resistant, but it's kind of based on very unlikely thing like choosing a pledge number that belongs to your coercer. Is that a reason you do not recommend it, or are there more practical reasons?
Well, as I mentioned, I mean, it's not just the danger that you might light on the coercer's tracker number. There is the danger that the coercer may claim, right? So you're being coerced, so you know that you're claiming that your tracker number is not your real one, and so the coercer is telling you that actually you've chosen my tracker number. By construction, the coercer can't prove that it's his tracker number. So you're now in a very awkward sort of epistemic situation. You know that he maybe knows that it's not really your tracker. So, if he's threatening to blow off your kneecaps, I think a lot of voters would be very nervous in that situation, even if it is a kind of remote possibility and Now, there is a countermeasure which I didn't have the time to describe, which I think is reasonably good. But you have to worry about the sort of trust assumptions you're making. I mean, again, I didn't really have time to mention it, but you have to assume that there are sort of private channels to communicate these values, like the G to the R, right? Of itself, that's not kind of privacy critical, because it still has to be put into an AlGamal ciphertext and decrypted, so it doesn't of itself reveal the tracker. But of course, if a coercer can monitor the transactions and see which G to the R was sent to you, then he can tell that, you know, or force you to open up the encryption with that value rather than the value that you're claiming you got. So I think we have to be very careful about analyzing the assumptions, you know, the underlying system, the communication channels, and so on. And you know, there are questions about what is the best way to communicate these values to the voters. Do you just send them in emails, or by some other channel, which we're still thinking about? And maybe we can overcome these and make it into a system which is as good as any other, if you like. But yeah.
Thanks.
I think the topic deserves much further discussion, animated discussion, but let's do it at the reception, which starts in 45 minutes.
You're right.
So, thank you, Peter.
Okay, thank you.